Hello and welcome. Thank you for listening. I'm joined by Professor Steve Keen, um, which is a great honour because he's a very interesting economist. I kind of hate to use the word alternative economist because
Be
it kind
like
of sounds a bit weird.
alternative facts.
Yeah, alternative facts. Well, nowadays, yes. I was thinking more alternative comedian, which is also a term that kind of lost all currency as
Mm,
they all became the same. But you haven't become the same as
no.
all economists. That's not the impression that I've informed, and
Mm.
I'm sure you'd be mortified if anyone ever said that you had.
Obviously, one time with my first marriage, I made some faux pas inside the house, and I told my wife she could put me down, and she said, "Oh, yes, sir, Steve's a neoclassical economist," which is probably the best put down everybody's ever given me.
And what shade of beetroot rage did you turn at hearing that?
It was the sheer humour of it was just so
Oh,
perfectly
fair
timed.
enough.
I couldn't say anything other than laugh.
Fair enough. So before we dive into the questions, then, which are a bit of an eclectic mix,
Hmm.
um, just give a brief overview of basically where you sit in the economics field. So we've
Mm.
just established you're not a neoclassical
Yeah,
economist.
yeah.
Um, I know you see the mainstream economics profession as being something which is deeply flawed.
Mm.
So why do you think that, and what do you think can be done about it? What are
Well,
you yourself doing about it?
yeah, any attempt to analyze any system has to start from some theoretical framework, and the framework, if you're lucky, is based on a objective observation of reality with a model that makes sense of what you observe. And one of the best examples of that was the Ptolemaic system of astronomy, where the way to make sense of what you observed in the sphere or the sky above you was that the Earth is the center of the universe. The planets orbited around the Earth, and the stars did the same. And the strange reason for the planets behaving strangely, behaving like wanderers, as their name actually means, is that they were circling you on perfect spheres, which themselves were also on perfect spheres that circled your planet. And with a few little tweaks here and there, you could perfectly match and perfectly predict both forwards and backwards the movements of the planets. Nice organising framework probably was completely wrong, but it worked for 1500 years. Now, the reason it broke down is because the whole model said that the heavens were perfect and the Earth was where decay occurred, and then Galileo makes the mistake of inventing a telescope. We see craters on the moon, and that starts to bring that ideology down. But when you have a confirmation between the model you have of the world and what appears to happen, that can last an incredible length of time. Now, not much happens in the solar system over a 20,000 year time frame, which is pretty much humans' entire period of cogitating about the
Mm.
nature of the universe. But a lot happens in 50 years in an economy. And what happened with neoclassical economics is they built a model that tried to argue that markets could reach equilibrium without government intervention. That was really the model in
Is this the
eighteen seventy.
valuation?
Volra's model, yeah.
Yeah.
Volra, you have to see a lot of neoclassical economics as a reaction to Marx, because Marx took the previous school of thought, which is called classical economics, and turned it from being a defense of capitalism and an attack on feudalism to an attack on capitalism and championing of socialism. And the reaction of mainstream economists was to jump onto a totally different theoretical framework, emphasizing utility rather than objective cost, which was the classical school. But as part of that, they try to argue markets are the sort of the perfect apolitical way of solving all problems. So the first stage of that was to try to establish that markets without any coordination whatsoever could reach equilibrium, so all markets supply and equal demand in all markets. Now, to handle the mathematics of that back in the 1870s, Volra decided to abstract from a few little elements that made life more complicated, one of which was we don't want money in there because money complicates everything. Let's presume everything is based on barter. And then let's presume that we don't want disequilibrium trades to occur because that would cause redistributions of wealth, and we don't want to have that happen. Let's assume no trade occurs until the markets are in perfect equilibrium. In other words, you jiggle your way around and then you finally converge on this equilibrium.
This was the. I just want to dwell on this a little
Yeah,
bit because I know that a lot of people listening to this, they won't have a background in
yeah,
economics, and I know that when you explain this to people, it blows their minds
yeah.
that the the theory that he came up with, and it wasn't really a theory that he said this is how it works. And I know you've written something recently about this.
Mm,
It was kind of reduced to, well, the economy operates as if this is what's happening.
As if,
Yeah,
yeah.
which I think you mentioned the Ptolemaic system earlier. That's the equivalent. That's the one where they started observing. Well, actually, what we observe and what our theory is are not the same thing. So let's tweak the theory and pretend that the some of the planets do a bit of a loop the loop.
Yeah,
Which
yeah,
obviously they don't, but that was trying to fit the fact
yeah,
that they observed with the flow of theory. Likewise, you go, well, we know that there isn't this Valrasian auctioneer who shouts out prices. Because that's the idea, isn't it? Is that
yeah.
someone just shouts out prices for everything in the economy until everything balances, which is as crazy as it sounds. Now, rather than say that's what happens, say, well, it all works as if that happens, and then kind of wave hands and run away.
And then put a few more little as-is on top of it, and everything is as if, as if, as if. When in fact, when you look at it carefully, it's as isn't.
Yeah.
And that's the trouble. You had a theory which extrapolated the data very reasonably. If you tweak the many parameters, you had to tweak it enough to make your numerical estimations actually fit past data. But as soon as there was a change in the actual real economy, which you had absolutely not virtually no resemblance to, but far enough away to be irrelevant, as soon as there was change in trend in what was driving the real system, your model collapsed. And that's what happened in 2008. So the idea that you can actually abstract from banking, that you can presume that all trades occur in equilibrium, and that you can presume the market is perfectly coordinating without any tendencies to financial crises and so on, is ludicrous. But once you've built the whole intellectual edifice in your brain and accepted that as how you have to reason about the economy, it means you lock out any countervailing elements of reality until it smashes you in the face. And that's what happened in 2008. So the mainstream of the economics profession, which I'd guess is something like about, in terms of fellow travellers plus true believers, 80% of the profession, there's about 15 to 20% that are rebels for various descriptions. I'm part of that rebel group.
You make it sound like Star Wars.
It is weird. It gets very close. I mean, the Death Star was DSGE models. Only the
Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium.
That's the one that they thought was the ants' pants, and they believed it was the perfect way to predict the economy. They understood everything, and then 2008 happened, and their models had absolutely no inkling that the crisis is going to occur. But yeah, it's a Death Star. It's versus Rebel Alliance.
I said that to clarify DSG, and then I realised that doesn't clarify it at all. But
No.
I think if we tried to do that, it would probably we just disappear down. Yeah, well, it's another show, and it's a real Alice in Wonderland show. I would have thought.
Totally.
So let's not do that.
Yeah, but the funny thing is, people normally think that this is the usual story for expertise. You think the experts are the ones who've got the top jobs and the top positions in the profession, and generally that's true. You can trust engineers, you can trust scientists in general. I believe you can trust climate scientists, despite what's happening in the States right now. Trusting economists, you're actually trusting an intellectual sect which took it over in the 1870s, really as a political agenda, fighting the right wing fighting a left wing agenda. The right and left are both wrong, and we've got an unrealistic model. I'm trying to build realism.
I broadly agree with that. I just want to push back a little bit. Feel a little bit weird doing this, but to sort of go into bat in defence of the economics profession, isn't it inevitably going to be the case that it will lend itself to that kind of sect, as you put it, because it's not a science and it's not something which you could have experimentation. So do you think the problem is that it kind of forgot that and then?
Yeah, it's a major issue because any intellectual area, people will become wedded to their particular explanation for whatever reality they're looking at. You've seen this in physics. You've got the area of string theory in physics where people believe that their organizing idea was that matter actually consists of very tiny vibrating strings vibrating in multiple dimensions. I think the actual had 11 dimensions was the low level they came down to describe reality. And there's a whole revolt against string theory with a book called Not Even Wrong by Elise Smolin, which says that this thing was done originally to try to replace 7 parameters that they had to simply take as constants. So pi, the value of E, etc., about 7 constants they couldn't explain. And now they've got themselves with 10 to the 380 constants, or something ridiculous like that. They've gone down the plug hole. Yeah. So to actually stop us doing that as a species, you need to have experimental data that says, hang on, your model just doesn't fit.
Which is very difficult doing economics because you can't run a series of economies.
Yeah.
You reminded me though that I remember seeing a documentary a few years ago about physicists at CERN, just shortly after they turned on the Large Hadron Collider.
Yeah.
And I'm no physicist, and I didn't understand the specifics of it, but I do remember there was one guy who was saying that some of the people here have seen their theories demolished by the data that are coming out. And he was kind of fingers crossed ours is still standing. But it was quite interesting that he was fully prepared to see his life's work go up in smoke if the facts required it to be so. Whereas I can't think of how that would work. There were occasions in economics where that might work, but they're far fewer and further between. Because you can always say, well, we don't have the counterfactual, so take quantitative easing.
Yeah.
Well, that hasn't worked as advertised, but well, maybe things would have been worse, and it never really gets resolved, which is why people still write theses on the Great Depression, which was a lifetime ago, because no one ever knows.
Yeah, and that's the trouble. It is very hard to tie to an objective reality when you can't actually model the objective reality in an experiment. But what fundamentally there are various as-if assumptions that truly are as-isn't. You simply say, for example, one of the common assumptions in mainstream economics is that marginal cost rises, and that explains why price rises. Bullshit. There have been about 100 studies taking a look at every last one, including one done by Alan Blinder, who was then he's actually been president of the American Economic Association. He was the deputy president of the Federal Reserve. Every last one has found marginal cost falls for the majority of firms, and yet they model as if it rises. Well, that's an as-isn't assumption.
Yeah.
Equally, they assume that banking doesn't matter. Now, I think after the financial crisis, hopefully people realise that's got a slight logical flaw to it. So there's many things that they've made assumptions which is categorically they're wrong.
Can I just dwell on that just to clarify a little bit? So banking doesn't matter. Am I right in thinking that you're saying that's how the standard textbook economic idea of how the economy works goes? Well, I mean, sometimes it explains banking, but it explains it in a really weird way. It doesn't really go into the fact that banks create money. That always surprises people when you say to them and say, well, that's where most money comes from. And they go, no, I thought it was like a central bank or some kind of authority or the government put it out there. No, it's created by banks making loans, putting that money into the account of the person who's taking the loan, and simultaneously having an asset on their balance sheet to balance it up. Don't want to go into all that, but your point is that the economics profession looked at that and went, well, that's kind of a bit hard and not really what we want to say. So let's put it to one side
and pretend something else applies.
Yeah.
And in that case, you really have got an objective reality. You can say, look, your model of money creation, which is the textbook model, violates the laws of accounting. Yeah. It is simply impossible. It's cannot be done. This parrot is no more type stuff. But you're dealing with the guy behind the counter who insists the parrot is alive. I'm sorry, it's dead. And fortunately, the Bank of England has come out and said that's for us recently. So there are, even though you can't do tests and empirical work, you can say there's an empirical reality. We have got the data on. Your model is wrong. Drop the bloody thing rather than trying to perpetuate it. But
that doesn't happen as quickly as you might think. I mean, to get back to my physicist examples, he was sitting there at CERN going, so far my theory is safe, but it might, ask me next week, they might have found out that I've been wrong my entire career. You don't really see that in economics. So you don't see people go, well, you have occasional ones. You cited recently Olivier Blanchard as an example of someone who went publicly said, I've got this a bit wrong.
Yeah. It's an incredibly slow process. And again, if you look back at the Great Depression, the same thing happened back then. You had mainstream economics completely triumphant about its capacity to understand the economy. Irving Fisher being the primary example of that, and literally in the middle of the stock market crash made that comment about stocks appear to have reached what appears to be a permanently high plateau. The rest of the line for your investing friends here was that I doubt that there will ever be a 50 or 60 point break such as Mr. Babson is predicting. Babson being a bear commentator, of course, it fell 180 points in the next couple of weeks. So, but they fell into despair at the end of the Great Depression, and that's when Keynes's ideas effectively took over, but they basically reinterpreted Keynes to fit back in their Walrasian framework. And what they call their main model was before DSG models came in, ISLM models, which Krugman, for example, continues trumpeting. That was actually a Walrasian model invented by Hicks 2 years before he read Keynes. So the desire to go back to that belief system is so strong. And when you mention physicists, they've got the same thing, but the experimental barrier is so great that sometimes they'll be forced to
Yeah.
let it collapse. Now, equally, there's now new research coming out on what's called the double slit experiment, which is a major contributor to the understanding we have of quantum mechanics, which is now maybe violating the popular interpretation of that 70 or 80 years after it was made. Now, it's still, physicists don't instantly flip over to saying we've got to have a classical interpretation of that now, as opposed to the probabilistic one we had for the last 70 years. So I'm not criticizing economists for being some bizarre aberration. It's just the aberration is, as you say, they don't have that experimental method as an absolute
So it
categorical
takes
cutoff.
much longer
Much
than
longer.
in other disciplines.
And they can go back and reinforce their
I
beliefs.
guess for progress to be made.
Yeah, and they can go back and reinforce their old beliefs all the time.
Yeah.
So my main thing I've been saying, I'm trying to make sure we don't do it again after this crisis. We did do it after the Great Depression.
I'm very keen to get into some questions about sort of some external stuff that's going on in the world, but just very quickly before I do, do you think, because you're saying you're very keen to make sure that economics as a profession doesn't just fall into its old habits and forget and just ignore what's been learned? Do you think that's happening? I'm thinking specifically, you talk about the triumphalism that was evident pre-crisis. One of the worries I have is that when you see regulators who are economists, I think particularly central banks, talking about financial stability, talking about the rules they've put in place and how much safer that's made the system, this is a very simplistic way of analysing it, but I sense quite a bit of hubris there, and that worries me.
Well, the hubris was obviously on steroids in 2007, and the regulators who were about like Adair Turner were just completely gobsmacked by what happened. Adair was at the incredible luck of being appointed chair of the Financial Stability Commission, I think it was, the week of the crisis.
Yeah. But at least then he can say, well, this thing was already happening when I turned up.
Yeah, well, he was.
Well, that's what he says in his book.
Yeah, he's quite right too. But he's changed his mind quite substantially over time. And I've got a lot of respect for English writers in general on that front, actually, compared to American. So there is that type of change. But the hubris is still a tendency they're going to come back to, because when you become an economist, you become an expert not on the economy, but on your model of the economy. And then if you really, really work and fit your model to the data, and it appears to fit the data with these as-isn't assumptions throughout them, then you'll defend it until it completely collapses on you. And that core belief system is still there. So like Olivier Blanchard, and he and I've corresponded a bit since those, and quite pleasantly after that, those emails came out. He, in saying, well, we've obviously made a huge mistake with DSG models, but he said, well, what can we do but derive macroeconomics from micro? What else? What other route is there? And because they then fall back into looking at utility maximizing individuals and profit maximizing firms and trying to aggregate from that level up.
Even though there are bits of micro that say, what you shouldn't do is aggregate this up because it won't work.
Yeah, I know.
So you sit in one class.
Yeah.
I remember this from when I was doing my study. You sit in one class and say, well, you can't aggregate this up. It isn't going to work. And then you go the next one. They go, what was done?
Assuming we aggregated okay.
And everyone puts their hand up, and then they kind of, and people come. It's a strange discipline to be involved in.
That's the trouble. I mean, because there's a teleological side to it, and meaning that you've got to be objective you wish to reach, and you have a set of mathematical concepts you start from, and you find you don't quite make it there. So let's assume we get past this little problem, and that's for that reason I've started describing what they do as not mathematics but mythematics. You want to reach a mythical future. You use mathematics to appear to get there. There's a point you can't get over, so you simply make some crazy assumption and do it. For people have suffered through the capital asset pricing model, for example. If you read Sharpe's original paper, he says in that they've got to drive the nice little model of an individual. That's all I've done. This is the market line, and all this stuff is an individual perception. How do I aggregate it? Well, the only way to aggregate is to assume that all individuals have the same risk-free rate of interest. So you can all borrow or lend money at the same rate, infinite amounts in either direction. And we all have exactly the same expectations about the standard deviations and mean returns on every share on the stock market. Let's keep on going then.
Yeah.
hang on a
I mean, it
second,
wouldn't
you're
be a
off with the
market if everyone had all the same.
exactly.
There would be no such market.
Exactly, exactly. So that's, and you'll find that abounds in neoclassical theory. Rather than saying we only have got a theory of individual, once we accept that individuals differ, therefore this no longer works to aggregate. Therefore, we have to find we're going to have outcomes at the aggregate level which are not an extrapolation of what's happening at the micro level. And they say, well, that's too that's too hard. That doesn't give us the result we want.
Hmm.
So let's assume we can aggregate by making everybody exactly
And it's not
the
as
same.
logically and intuitively appealing a lot of the time, and
There's a classic, the old humorous mention from America, had a wonderful statement saying to every human problem there's a simple solution that is neat, plausible, and wrong.
Yeah.
And that unfortunately summarizes neoclassical economics. It's neat and plausible enough to fool people, but it's wrong.
Yeah. I want to ask you about obviously a very big topic here, at the moment for anyone listening, and that's obviously Brexit. Now, you said before that you think Britain leaving the EU is the right thing for Britain to do, and you've talked about the EU in terms of whether it's a club Britain should even want to be a member of at all. Is that because you just think Britain and the EU just aren't a very good fit for each other, or do you think all members should be looking to get out of the EU because perhaps it's in some kind of existential crisis, which some people are saying?
It was a crisis right from the beginning of forming the euro. That was the major problem. You can take it on a political angle further and say just how much commonality do you have between these states, and was it ever feasible to try to get to the United States of Europe, which really was the vision that was behind and still is behind the European Union. But my point really comes down to the creation of the euro and what a monumental disaster that was. And the impact of that disaster is, of course, mainly felt for those who are inside the euro region itself. But because the European Union was based on the four principles of free movement, including free movement of labour and capital, that's fine so long as people move for episodic reasons. If they move because they prefer the weather in London to the weather in Spain, for example. Well, actually, they're leaving because there's a systemic breakdown of the Spanish economy, courtesy of the euro, and that's why they're coming over here. And rather than getting episodic levels of migration, you get systemic breakdown levels of migration, and that causes social frictions, which are now leading to a rise of xenophobia in Europe in general. So the actual design of the euro is disastrous. It's caused an economic crisis. Thank God England made the decision not to surrender the pound and take up the euro. But even after that's been done, while it's still the European Union is still a dysfunctional economic system, then because you're part of that free movement thing, you caught people escaping systemic breakdown. And that's where the rise of UKIP came from.
Do you think part of the failing on the part of successive British governments was not to address that properly? Because if you've got lots of people arriving because, as you say, they're escaping a systemic breakdown at home, they're finding jobs in a lot of cases. They're paying taxes. Could that the argument is often made that tax revenue could and should have been used to make sure there wasn't a strain on public services.
Well, the real problem was that at the same time as you had that happening, the Conservatives were going in for total austerity. And Labor, as their rival, bought the argument that their spending caused the crisis, which is total crap.
Yeah.
But that meant that as well as having people, systemic levels of migration turning up and putting pressure on your services, you were destroying the services at the same time. So it was a double whammy. It wasn't just the
Here's the question then. So had that other mistake not been made, and had they had services provision, would it just have kept things going a bit longer, or could we? I'm thinking just of Britain here, have managed inflows of people in such a way that you didn't get the rise in xenophobia, that it didn't become a social problem.
But there's a whole lot of interacting elements.
And there's a lot of ifs, buts, and maybes in that as well.
I think it was always in a hiding down to the breakdown. My favourite article in the European Union was written in 1992 by Wynne Godley. I mentioned this numerous times.
I read that after I saw you recommend it a couple of years ago. It is very good.
And he just basically says that because the people who designed the euro, because they only established a central bank, must believe that's all you need for economic union. They therefore must believe capitalism is inherently stable.
Do you think that's true, though? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I've never... My own read of it, you may disagree, but my own read of it is that they always knew you needed more. They just thought that that was all as far as
I
they could
think
go with
there's
it.
a potential belief that could have been part of it. It would have been too difficult to build a treasury, easier
Yeah.
to build its common currency. And
But the
then,
assumption was that eventually it would become self-evident they needed one. It would just happen,
but the
which obviously
trouble is,
hasn't happened.
they didn't have to have a single currency combined with the 60% limit on government debt and the 3% limit on government deficits. If they simply have a currency and made no rules whatsoever about that, then it would have been feasible potentially to say, okay, well, it's not working as well as we'd like it to, but you're not imposing austerity on economies in a downturn, which is what they ended up doing courtesy of those rules. Maybe we need a treasury to make it work better. But it wasn't just the fact that it was only the central bank, it was also the rules on government spending.
Do you think there's a paradox there? Because those rules, I remember when all that harmonisation was happening in the late 90s, in the run-up to the launch of the euro, and the idea was that, well, probably this is not anything close to an optimum currency area. We'll probably need to get our economies to converge, and that way we're not going to have a problem. But paradoxically, by trying to do that, it created a situation that when a crisis did occur, they couldn't actually do what
they
economies tend to
diverged
do
dramatically.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is the Growth and Stability Pact. That's a funny one. Tell me something else. There's actually been the Stagnation and Instability Pact. So the rules have actually made the outcome far, far worse. And it is not just fighting like an inappropriate currency union. It's also fighting inappropriate rules. But another part of which is quite intriguing, I heard in Berlin just recently, is that also as one of the other rules they agreed to, or one of the other objectives they agreed to, not a rule, was to target a 2% rate of inflation. Now, what you actually had happen was that Germany hit about 1%, France hit about 2%, Italy hit about 3%. Those are the three major trading partners, of course, in the bloc. Well, that means as a result, over every year, German manufacturers were gaining a 2% cost advantage over Italian manufacturers, which ultimately means, of course, that people don't buy Lamborghinis and Fiats anymore. They buy Mercedes because for the same features, they're cheaper. It's not about labour productivity alone. It's about the rate of inflation, which comes down to the rate of wage change. Because the Germans suppressed the rate of wage change, their rate of inflation was lower. And that was 1% below the level they agreed to. Now, if they'd agreed to 2%, and France hit 2%, and Italy maybe suppressed its wage gap, and they'll hit 2%, you wouldn't have these imbalances. But they've built up over 15, going on coming close to 20 years now. And those level of imbalances mean that fundamentally, Italian industry can't compete with German industry, not because of productivity differences so much, but wage costs combined with that.
So that's a dynamic which obviously leads to the trade surplus that Germany has.
Huge.
But on top of that, and this is something I think I've seen a few people like, but I think you're one of them, is that when you have the euro that everybody in that single currency has, Germany is exporting out to the rest of the world. They're exporting within the Eurozone on a flat currency, so that they're enjoying the benefit you just described of having lower inflation and year after year after year opening up this gap, which makes them more competitive. But you're not getting what you might have had if they had the Deutschmark, an adjustment whereby their currency gets stronger, and not only does it perhaps offset some of that dynamic vis-a-vis Italy, but also vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
Absolutely. That's why Trump's complaining about Germany having an undervalued currency, and he's bloody right on that front. If you can run a 9% of GDP trade surplus, which is the level Germany's now hit, and a lot of that is with the rest of the world. The EU itself overall is balanced, so there's a huge imbalance with Germany's got a huge trade surplus with the rest of Europe, but it's also got it with the rest of the world. And on that scale, I think Germany's trade balance now is the same scale as China's. Now, that's ludicrous to have a country of 70 million people.
Because you can't really argue that this is export-led growth of a developing economy.
No, it is devalued currency-led growth. And the rest of the world is paying a price for that as well as Europe itself. So, that's another reason why you should break it down.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people think of currency wars as something that kind of flared up since the crisis, but potentially you could make the argument that this was a stealth operation. I mean, I'm sounding a little bit like a paranoid conspiracy theorist. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying.
Schäuble?
No, but I've read enough of what he says.
That's one of the few times I'm going to let a conspiracy theory slip through to the keeper, because the extent to which they're just turning a blind eye to the ludicrous gains they're making out of the euro and claiming he gets offended when people say Germany's benefited out of the euro. What crap! Of course they've benefited dramatically.
Yeah. We just touched on trade, and you mentioned Trump. You wrote a piece for Forbes just after the US election about free trade and about why you basically attack the idea that free trade is a good thing for everybody, and perhaps the problem is that the gains from free trade haven't been distributed as well as they should have been. But I remember what you were saying is that those gains weren't there in the first place. And to get slightly economics and nerdy for a second, although we shouldn't be ashamed to do so, and we already have. You went right to the heart of this, and you went after the David Ricardo theory of comparative advantage. Can you just first of all quickly sort of walk people through what that idea is and why comparative advantage is supposed to be so great, and what's wrong with it?
Okay. Well, Ricardo was fighting against the Corn Laws, which restricted the import of wheat. I think it was. That's what they called corn back then, into England from the continent. And Ricardo's driving motivation was that he wanted to get as much of the surplus generated in capitalism to the hands of capitalists rather than landlords, because he believed capitalists would invest and continue growth going further. Landlords were just wasted on profligate behaviour. So anything that reduced the cost of wages was a good thing, because by dropping the cost of wages, more of the profits, more of the surplus would go to capitalists. There'd be more investment. You'd delay what he saw as an inevitable stationary state in the future and get a higher level of wealth at the time he got there. Now, in fighting his argument, he believed if you drop the price of, drop the tariffs, that would drop wages, which would mean therefore more surplus going to capitalists, and that's what his objective was. But his political opponents would say, look, if you drop the tariffs, Portugal, at that stage was the major competitor for England, is better than us at everything. So we'll end up undercutting all our industry and we'll lose jobs and we'll be impoverished. We won't actually get benefit out of it. And one of the cleverest intellectual debating tricks ever, Ricardo said, I'm going to assume you're right and prove you're wrong. What he said was, I'm going to assume Portugal is better at producing wine and cloth than England. And he measured the extent to which they were better and the number of workers needed to produce those two goods in both the countries. So he had, I think in England took 120 workers to produce X amount of wine, and 90 workers in Portugal, and then 100 workers to produce cloth in England, and say 95 workers in Portugal.
So Portugal is more efficient at
producing both. What he then said, what will happen is Portugal will go across to entirely producing wine. England will go across to entirely producing cloth. That'll produce more cloth and more wine in the aggregate, and we can trade the difference and gain from that trade. And that's the basic proposition, which it's been twisted, bent to make look at capital labour substitution and things like that. But what is being presumed is you can efficiently move all your resources from one industry to another without loss of productive capacity. And when Ricardo stated it, he's talking in terms of labour. So, yes, you can retrain a shepherd to become a vigneron. Okay? You can't retrain a sheep dip to become a wine press. You destroy capital in one sense or another. Either it's left idle, or you've got to sell it for a dramatic drop in its value because it's now being undercut by foreign capital that it produces at a lower cost. So you have a loss of capital. And if you factor that into your logic, then there's no longer any necessity that there's going to be a gain from trade.
I just want to stress that point. So you're not saying that there won't be a gain from trade. You're just saying you can't automatically assume it anymore. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't be.
Yeah, and in fact, it's a question of, it really comes down to what's your best way of getting that increase in productivity? Is it by specialisation or is it by innovation? And the whole focus on economic theory has been about specialisation given your current resources. When the real world we live in, your readers live in, I hope, is one where you get improved productivity over time, and that's what's the main source of growth comes from. So because economists got this little trick on specialisation, they became a one-horse pony that's all about specialisation improving everything, which is why they were paranoid about Brexit, because, oh dear, that means you're going to have a smaller trading bloc, therefore specialisation diminishes, therefore we're going to have losses. which I just saw as a panic reaction based on a false theory rather than looking at the actual
Because
situation.
one of the other points you made in that same article was that specialisation, well, what you just made, economists see it as being what drives it, but actually what has driven growth in economies, over the years hasn't been specialisation so much as diversity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And use the sailboard example.
Yeah, and this is beautiful empirical work being done by non-economists now of what's called the Atlas of Economic Complexity at Harvard University, and looking at countries' growth patterns, they found the best predictor of successful growth is not specialization, it's diversification. The more diversified economies can grow, and the reason that they say this actually leads to growth is that a lot of innovation comes out of combining existing industries. So the sailboard example is a great one, because if you want to invent sailboards, it helps to have a sails manufacturer and a surfboard manufacturer in the same location. And then you put the two together, bang, you've got a whole new industry. And this is partly behind Michael Porter's arguments about what he calls competitive advantage.
That's how you invent a good cocktail as well. You go somewhere that just does beer or just does wine, but if they've got the whole top shelf, who knows what you can get?
Yeah, indeed. I found that myself the hard way on a few occasions. and that's. And
do you think there's an irony here? Actually, it just occurred to me as you're explaining that. What's the project called? The Atlas World.
The Atlas of Economic Complexity.
Atlas of Economic Complexity.
Yeah.
These are non-economists, and again, it's kind of speaks to the idea of diversity. There's some of the breakthroughs and some of the most interesting ideas in economics do come from economic outsiders. Behavioral economics, a lot of that came from psychologists. People coming in and go, well, why do you think that? That doesn't, it's just interesting that if academia was all economists, you couldn't even do that. No. Similarly, if it was all surfboards, you couldn't have a sailboard.
Yeah. And that's the.
I just find that quite a nice irony.
And it's also if you actually read Kuhn's work on the structure of scientific revolutions, he points out that change often comes in a discipline where there's a paradigm breakdown, which is what we should be going through now, and practically we are going through. When that paradigm breakdown occurs, it's often people slightly outside the profession who bring in the new theorem because they're capable of thinking from a different foundation. And one thing which is interesting right now in history is a guy called Peter Turchin is developing what is called cliodynamics, and this is using basically large-scale systems of differential equations, which is the area that I work in, to model historical trends. And his work, I think, is far more realistic than economic theory applied to the generic area of history, meaning what's happening politically and economically, not just on the economic side. And that sort of work, I think, is letting the social sciences have like a quantifiable and prediction-based theorem, which is not coming out of economics, but of history.
Do you think that can be achieved? Because there is a sense that social science, and particularly if you're modelling it, you say he's using differential equations to do that. Presumably, you're going to have to make quite a lot of assumptions about what your terms are and what measurable things are going to proxy for various things.
It's never as straightforward as the physical sciences. We've actually got measurable entities that you're basing your empirical work on. But I'm pretty persuaded by when you have a system and there's interactions between institutions, between finance and economic output and so on, between energy input and what you get out as production. If you describe those constraints fairly accurately, you can get a very reasonable approximation, not obviously as accurate as physical theorems will be, but you can capture those dynamics. That's what I did with Minsky's financial instability hypothesis myself. And I think Turchin's doing a similar job, talking about things like he focuses very much what he calls elite formation. Are there too many people being produced who want to get into the elite versus the number of spaces that are available? That's part of his explanation of what's happening in America right now. And he found the same explanation applies to the breakdown of the Roman Empire, the same explanation to the Civil War in America. And then you find the trends in his indicators reliably capture that dynamic.
I mean, these sound like very hard things to quantify.
But therefore, we shouldn't do it.
Well, no. Well, this you've. That wasn't going to be that wasn't going to be my question. My question is how much of the value do you think is in the output of such a model, and how much of it is in identifying specifically what it is you don't know. So you might, even if that's just,
This-
if all you get is a bit of humility out of that, perhaps that's
that-
beneficial.
And that's largely the orientation I've got. Like, I do numerical modelling, but I call myself qualitative systems of differential equations. By qualitative, what I mean is I'm not trying to pick the actual data. I'm trying to pick the overall trends that exist, and therefore I'm not going to be tested on whether my numbers are within 3% of the actual outcome. It's whether I'm getting the trends and the interaction of those trends that turn up in the real data. So I get explosions in private debt and collapses caused by it and so on. I'm not saying I can actually exactly model what happened in 2008, but I've got the causal processes right. And in a similar sense, Turchin's doing qualitative differential equation work as well. He's talking about trends which lead to breakdown. You can relate it to how many people are trying to become, senators for the American Congress when there's only, was it 100 of them? I keep on forgetting how many there are.
Yeah.
And that tension then leads to this form of breakdown in their political behavior, which leads to the outcomes we're seeing, the Republicans versus Democrats versus Trump in America.
And this is quite new stuff for the economics profession, but I always find it quite interesting that a lot of people who have studied economics and then go into the city, for example, and go into things where money is at stake. If you're analysing a company, and you might have a model of it, and you plug numbers into it, but you're aware all the time, possibly because money's on the line, that a lot of that you are making assumptions. A lot of this is qualitative, and I wonder whether that's part of why. I remember meeting a reader at an event a couple of months ago. He was saying his big thing was skin in the game. It's like, if you've got no skin in the game, you're not as incentivized to push harder to get it right. You will accept something which perhaps doesn't really stand up to that much scrutiny.
Yeah, and that's
because there's no. But if you're putting, a few million as an investment into a company, you're not just going to accept the output of a model without looking at what you don't know about it and how how much model risk there is.
You can still be deluded about it, but nonetheless, that's true. I mean,
but eventually you'll get a pretty sharp lesson in your
delusion. I would like to see what would happen to the IMF, for example, if the pay rates of the economists who advised the policies for Greece were related to the GDP performance they thought they were going to get versus what they actually got.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah. And this is Olivier Blanchard just recently. One of his internal memos about the impossibility of the conditions that are being posed on Greece, which he wrote in 2010, internal memos, has been leaked. And he wrote saying, I didn't leak it, I'm not sorry that it's out in the public. And when you look at it, he was saying, even from a conventional economic perspective, we're requiring Greece to suffer like a 14% fall in government spending, and we're presuming GDP won't fall at all. This has never been done in human history. And yet we're imposing this.
But we're going to act as if it will.
As if it'll work, And of course, the tragedy that's been caused there is we're pretty much turning Greece into Europe's Somalia. Now, none of the economists who are responsible for that copped pay rises or lost their jobs over it. So in that sense, they have got no skin in the game, and academic economists are one step even further removed. And a lot of what's being done by so-called practical economists is developing and applying the toy models that the economists build into giant models of the real world, and then imposing that as a basis for policy in those countries and causing disasters like Greece itself.
But again, they're not incentivized particularly not to do that, which is
rather
ironic
hard to
given how economics often like to talk about incentive structures and the importance thereof.
But they're independent. That's very true.
Yes, that's very true. Steve Keen, it's been an absolute pleasure, and
good fun.
it's been a very good discussion. Thanks very much for coming in.
You're welcome.